Good evening. My name is Jane Jotham and I'm the Museum Director and CEO of the Jewish Holocaust Centre, situated on the lands of the Bunurong people in Melbourne, Australia. I pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and I pay my respect to our Holocaust survivor elders, those with us and those past. On behalf of the board and the staff, I welcome everyone to this very special event, our annual Betty and Shmuel Rosenkranz Oration. What an interesting time we're living through, a historic period, which hopefully is giving us all a renewed appreciation of history. Living through it, we wonder, just how will humanity look back at this time? How will it be examined? What lessons will be learned? What will be the legacy of COVID-19? Thanks to the support of the Rosenkranz, Goldman and Lazarus families, it is our privilege each year to bring to you this oration, always striving to present thought-provoking content to add to the pantheon of Holocaust knowledge and awareness. This year is no exception. We've been exploring justice post-Holocaust in the form of trials. So to culminate, we will shortly be treated to a keynote speech by the highly regarded international lawyer and author, Philippe Sands. But firstly, I introduce Dr. Lois Peeler to formally welcome us to country and to touch on the Indigenous connection to this day, the anniversary of the November 1938 pogrom known as Kristallnacht, in tribute to Indigenous leader William Cooper and the protest of the Australian Aborigines League. Dr. Lois Peeler is a proud Yorta Yorta woman and Executive Director and Principal of Warrawa Aboriginal College.
I wish to acknowledge and pay my respect to our ancestors, elders, knowledge holders and fearless leaders, past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to all Aboriginal people who have unbroken connection to the lands and waters wherever they may be, and give thanks for their continued strength and leadership in upholding our law and culture. As First Nations people, our history is one of dispossession, dislocation, segregation, discrimination, and continuing struggle. In 1938, Uncle William and other members of the Australian Aborigines League walked across Melbourne to the German consul to deliver a letter registering their opposition to the persecution of the Jews by the Nazis. At a time when the Aboriginal people were experiencing injustice and inequality, the Australian Aborigines League put energy into protesting on behalf of people on the other side of the world. There is a song that binds us together, Burafera. The history of Burafera suggests a story that stretches across several continents and thousands of years. I am told that the Yorta Yorta lyrics are based on an ancient song within the Jewish tradition, known as the Song of the Sea, and sometimes called Miriam's Song. In a concert held to mark Melbourne's foundation in May 1937, the grand finale was the Aboriginal choir's singing of Burafera, translated into the Yorta Yorta language, which expressed their identification with the Jewish people as the dispossessed of the Book of Exodus. We join together in solidarity to remember those that have gone, but who still have presence.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us tonight. I can't quite believe that we're back here already and still on Zoom for tonight's event. It feels like just yesterday that we held last year's Oration online for the first time, and I remember quite clearly stating how much I was looking forward to seeing everyone in person next year. And yet here we are. That said, as I mentioned last year, as we entered this new technological frontier for memorial, education and connection, the opportunities that this strange new COVID world have provided for us are numerous, and finding those silver linings are, at least for me, a key part of processing the last 18 or so months and coming out with a smile on our faces. There is no doubt that it has been an incredibly challenging time for so many reasons, but the ability to still all be together on nights like this and have almost limitless access to incredible speakers and information is something really very special. The importance of the Betty and Shmuel Rosenkranz Oration has always been clear to me and my family. However, this year more so than ever has it truly been highlighted. My husband Jono and I were lucky enough to welcome our first child into the world in April, Isaac, named for my late father's brother Itzhak, who was lost in the gas chambers at Auschwitz as a 9-year-old, will likely never have the opportunity to really understand what happened during the Holocaust from those who experienced it firsthand. He will never hear his great Zayda Shmuel tell of his story in escaping into the woods outside Vienna on Kristallnacht. Never before have I truly and wholeheartedly understood the concept and importance of sharing our history, our stories, our hardships, and our triumphs until Isaac entered the world. With this new perspective firmly in mind, it is my great honour to be able to introduce to you our very special speaker for tonight's oration. Throughout history, Jews have experienced some of the greatest injustices and atrocities, and unfortunately, we still see anti-Semitism in the modern day, with a scary increase in recent times. Tonight's speaker, Professor Philippe Sands, has devoted his life to the practice of law and seeking justice for all within a vast array of contexts, including the environment, international trade, genocide, and human rights. He is here to speak to us to explore justice after the Holocaust, what Nuremberg meant for the rest of the world and himself, as reflected in his cases and books, and what the challenges are going forward. Born in London, Philippe Sands QC is a Professor of Law at University College London and a practising barrister at Matrix Chambers. He appears as counsel before the International Court of Justice and International Criminal Court and sits as an arbitrator at the International Centre for Settlement of Investment Disputes, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and the Court of Arbitration for Sport. He has also authored Lawless World, Torture Team, and several academic books on international law, as well as contributing to the New York Review of Books, Vanity Fair, the Financial Times, and The Guardian. His book, East-West Street, on the origins of genocide and crimes against humanity, has been awarded numerous prizes, including the 2016 Baillie Gifford Prize, the 2017 British Book Awards Non-Fiction Book of the Year, and the 2018 Prix Montaigne. This is just a short excerpt of what is an exceptional and inspirational career to date. So, without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you all Professor Philippe Sands.
It's incredibly wonderful to be giving this oration to the Melbourne Jewish Holocaust Centre. I wish I was with you in person, but I'm not. For reasons everyone understands, I'm in London and I send you greetings from afar. It's been a little time since I was last with you and things have moved on, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how things have moved on in my work and in the kinds of issues that we face. This year is the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg judgment, so it has been a point of recollection, of reflection, to ask ourselves what has been achieved and what are the challenges. I had no idea when I accepted an invitation to go to the city of Lviv in Ukraine in the autumn of 2010 what would follow. As many of you know from reading my book East-West Street, the invitation was to give a lecture on my work on crimes against humanity and genocide. I've been involved in many cases before international courts and tribunals involving many horrors across the world, and of course there's also a personal aspect because of my mother's place and role in the Holocaust and the story of my grandparents. When I accepted that invitation, I really did so not because I had a burning desire to give a lecture, but because I wanted to find my grandfather's house. I wanted to find the place where he was born in 1904 in a city called Lemberg, which at the time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I found the house, as many of you will know, and I felt that I learned a lot from that. I learned more about my grandfather and his story and his identity, and by learning about his identity I learned a lot more about my identity. And a whole tale was unleashed. Accidentally, and I take no credit for it because I wasn't looking for any discoveries, I uncovered the fact that the two men who invented the concepts of crimes against humanity, which is intended to protect individuals, and the man who invented the concept of genocide, the protection of groups, both came from the city of Lemberg, Lwów, when it was in Poland. Hersch Lauterpacht would go on to be Professor of International Law at Cambridge University, a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trial, and a judge at the International Court of Justice. Raphael Lemkin had started off life as a criminal prosecutor, and he too helped in the prosecution at Nuremberg. In the course of that trial, they learned that the man they were prosecuting, Hans Frank, who had been Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer and who in 1939 became Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland, was actually responsible for the murder of their entire families. That is a huge thing. I do cases before international courts and tribunals, and I really can't imagine what it is like to open a door and learn that the man who sits just a few feet in front of you in the dock, Hans Frank in this case, was responsible for the killing of your entire families. That is a really huge thing. One of the things I discovered in writing East-West Street, beyond the significant role played by the three main men in the book, Hersch Lauterpacht, Raphael Lemkin, and Hans Frank, but also the story of my grandfather, was the vital difference that individuals can make. Human beings reach a crossroad, and they can do the right thing, or they can do the wrong thing, or they can do nothing. And one thing I've come to learn is that one really admires those who reach such a crossroad and do the right thing, even if it comes at a very great price, and even if the sacrifice they might make is liable to be the ultimate sacrifice. One such person, of course, is the remarkable Elsie Tilney. Elsie Tilney appeared in my grandfather's papers in that summer of 2010 when I was looking for the address of his house. It was a scrap of paper, a tiny scrap of paper. It just said Miss E.M. Tilney, Manuka, Bluebell Road, Norwich, Angleterre. One thing led to another, as it so often does in life. And I learnt that Elsie Tilney was an evangelical Christian missionary who came from Norwich, and she happened to be in Paris in early 1939, and she happened to meet my grandfather, who happened to tell her that he had a daughter, less than a year old, living in Vienna, who needed to be brought to safety. And what did Miss Tilney do? She went and got my mother. She travelled by train to Vienna and carried back a one-year-old infant to Paris and safety. I owe my existence to Elsie Tilney. If she had not done what she had done, I would not be here with you today. And I've learned in life you don't ever judge a book by its cover. Who knows how I would react to Elsie Tilney if I met her in the street? She didn't beat her breast and describe to others what she had done. In fact, she never told a single person all of the extraordinary things she did during that terrible conflict. But I owe my existence to her, and I'm intensely grateful for that. And it's made me reflect and think a lot about those individuals who do absolutely remarkable things. In writing East-West Street, other opportunities opened up. As some of you will know, I have come to know the son of Hans Frank, Nicholas Frank. He's a distinguished journalist, and curiously we've become very good friends. It's a remarkable thing to imagine that the son of a man hanged at Nuremberg exactly 75 years ago for the greatest crimes imaginable should become the friend of the grandson of one of his father's victims. But that is what has happened. And one day, Nicholas said to me, "Would you like to meet Horst Wächter?" I knew the Wächter name because Horst Wächter's father Otto Wächter had been the governor of Lemberg, Lviv, in 1942, when the final solution was implemented in District Galicia, of which Lemberg was the capital. So I knew the role played by the governor, and I said to Nicholas, why not? I'd love to meet Horst Wächter. I don't know why he'd want to meet me. Again, one thing led to another, and eventually, early in 2012, Nick and I travelled off to Hagenberg, Austria, a tiny village, where we met this remarkable man in his extraordinary home, a dilapidated 15th century schloss, a castle. Horst lives in real poverty, has 100 rooms, but only 2 or 3 of them were habitable or heated. And it was bitterly cold that first time that I met him in the early months of 2012. I liked Horst, but he was different from Nicholas. Nicholas bears the burden of having a father who murdered 4 million people and was convicted and sentenced to death for that and hanged. Can you imagine what it is like to have such a father? Nicholas despises his father. His book, The Father, which has recently been reissued in English, tells the story of that burning hatred. Indeed, the very first time that I met Nick, he told me as the first thing, he said, Philippe, you must understand, I'm against the death penalty in all cases, except in the case of my father. And then he put his hand in his jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph and showed me a photograph of the dead, hanged body of his father. It was, I have to say, pretty shocking. Horst is different. Horst looks for the good in his father. And so began an adventure, an exercise, an uncovering of another family. In a sense, East-West Street is about my family and my work and the work that I do in international criminal law. The rat line is what emerged from that meeting with Horst. It too followed an unlikely trail. It began with an article in the Financial Times newspaper in 2013. That caused a friend of mine, David Evans, who is a very distinguished filmmaker and director. You will know his work. He directs several of the episodes of Downton Abbey, to call me up and say that article in the FT, Philippe, would make a terrific documentary. And so we went off and made a documentary. And in the course of making that documentary, and by now we're 2014, 2015, we went to Lviv, Horst, Nicholas and me. And we spent a shocking day in the summer of 2014 near a town called Brody, which happens to be the hometown of the great writer Joseph Roth. Some of you will have read his Radetzky March or his letters. And we were attending a commemoration of Otto Wächter's Waffen-SS Galicia division, created by Otto Wächter in 1943. It was Horst who wanted to be there then. I found it appalling to see men today prancing around in Waffen-SS uniforms. Nicholas was appalled. But Horst was happy, not because he's a Holocaust denier, he's not because he's an anti-Semite, he's not because he's a racist, he's not, but because, as he often says to me, he wants to find the good in his father and believe that his father was a decent man. Actually, Otto Wächter was not a decent man. He was charged in 1938 with removing all Jews from public office. Then in 1939 he was appointed as governor of Krakow. He is the man who built the Krakow ghetto. And then in 1942 he was posted to District Galicia, where he oversaw the implementation of the final solution. In fact, in August 1942, Heinrich Himmler travelled to Lemberg to ask Wächter whether he wanted to remain in District Galicia or return to a desk job in Vienna or some such thing. And Wächter said, no, I want to stay and see this through. And he did see it through, and I've got the letters which show how efficiently he did his work and how pleased Heinrich Himmler was with his work. When the war came to an end, Otto Wächter was indicted for mass murder, but unlike Nicholas Frank, he disappeared. Anyway, back to the making of the film in the summer of 2014. Nicholas Frank was so appalled by Horst's behaviour, by his feelings of satisfaction at seeing people venerate his father that in an on-camera interview, not unlike this one, when I asked Nick whether how he explained Horst's attitude, Nick looked at me and said, "You know what, I think Horst could be a new kind of Nazi." Actually, I disagreed with that then, and I disagree with it now, and Nicholas has in fact retracted that view. But it's on camera, and it made it into the film which came out in 2015. When Horst saw that film, he was extremely distressed by that scene, and he asked me, "What can I do, Philippe, to prove that I'm not a Nazi?" Proving a negative, lawyers amongst you will know, is always a difficult thing. I reflected on Horst's interesting question and eventually came up with an idea. And the idea was that he should donate the archive of his family, which I'd become aware of but had not seen, really. I'd seen the odd photograph, the odd letter, the odd diary entry, but that was about it. 10,000 pages of letters, diaries, images, scrapbooks, and so on and so forth, that he should donate that to a museum. Terrific idea, Horst said, and he agreed to donate it to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. In fact, if you type in USHMM Wächter Archive, you'll be able to read the documents for yourself. Horst allowed the entire archive to be digitized, and it went off to Washington. And then Horst said to me, rather generously, "Would you like a copy, Philippe?" Possibly he regrets that, but I said yes, I would. And a few weeks later, a single USB stick landed in my home in London, where I'm speaking to you from, and I put it into my computer in this very room and was astonished by what I saw. Again, one thing led to another, and with a group of researchers and supported by the remarkable Lisa Jardine, a colleague of mine at University College London, we spent 4 years deciphering that material. And what did we learn? We learned what happened before the war, but even more remarkably, we learned what happened after the war. After the war, indicted, Otto Wächter disappeared off the face of the earth. But now with these documents, I was able to uncover what had happened to him. And what had happened to him was that he'd hidden in the Austrian mountains, not so far from Salzburg, where his wife Charlotte lived. In fact, Charlotte Wächter, I think, is the beating heart of my book, The Rat Line, because it tells the story of a love between a man and a woman, and how, for 3 years after the war, she saved him. He hid in the mountains, not so far from where she was living, and every 2 or 3 weeks she would toddle off with provisions, clothing, newspapers, food, skis, so on and so forth, to help him survive. But more to the point, Otto Wächter was not alone. He was in hiding in the mountains with a young Waffen-SS soldier called Burkhard Rathmann. All of this I discovered from Charlotte Wächter's archive, the materials that their son, Horst, gave me. And at one point I asked Horst, "Tell me about this Burkhard Rathmann. Why did he do what he did? What was his motivation? Did the family stay in touch with him after the war? What became of him?" And Horst smiled his sweet smile and said to me, "You know what, Philippe? I can answer all of your questions, or we can telephone him." So this was, as you can imagine, pretty surprising. We were 2017. The idea that Burkhard Rathmann engaged in these efforts to save the life of Otto Wächter in 1945 was still alive had never even occurred to me. But he was very much alive. He's actually passed away since then, and I had an opportunity to go visit him. It was one of the most remarkable meetings I had ever had. Interestingly, Burkhard Rathmann imposed a condition, and that condition was that I must ask no question about anything that happened before the 9th of May 1945. Why? Because Burkhard Rathmann had himself been in a Waffen-SS division which had committed the most terrible atrocities in Yugoslavia and in Italy. And Burkhard Rathmann, for the rest of his life, worried about what would happen to him. Could he face the tap on the shoulder? Could he be hauled off to a court of law to be tried, like some of these people who are still being tried today, aged 97, aged 100. It was one of the most remarkable meetings I'd ever had. And from that meeting, I learned that, indeed, Otto Wächter had decided he wanted to escape. He wanted to make his way out of Europe, along the rat line, to South America, to Argentina, like Mengele, like Eichmann, like Priebke, like Klaus Barbien, like so many others. And hence, I stumbled into a book that became The Rat Line. In a way, The Rat Line is a counterpoint to East-West Street. East-West Street, as I mentioned, is about my family. The Rat Line is about the Wächters. Why did I write it? Why would I devote so much time and effort to writing a second book? It's not exactly the same subject, but of course there's quite a lot of overlap. And the answer to that question is that it raises the $64 million question. Why do decent, honourable, educated, religious, intelligent, cultured human beings get involved in the most terrible things? And that is an issue for our day. That question has not gone away. We see that today. We see that with the rise of nationalism, with the rise of xenophobia, and with the rise of populism. I see that in the United Kingdom. You see that in Australia. And the United States has certainly seen it under the presidency of Donald Trump, but I think that continues today. So these are the kinds of issues that I'm interested in. These are the kinds of things that motivate me, and they cause me to put on the table what is the most fundamental of issues. That ultimately, when good things happen and when terrible things happen, it is individuals who are at the heart of it. And we need to understand those individuals. I open The Rat Line with a quotation from the great Spanish writer Javier Cercas. It's more important to know the motives of the victim than it's more important to know the motives of the perpetrator than the victim. I am, of course, deeply concerned about victims, but ultimately, if we want to stop these horrors from happening, we need to understand the victims. And in The Rat Line, I think I've come closer to understanding how it is that ordinary folk get involved in mass murder. I said at the beginning that this is an important year. It's the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg judgment, which was handed down on the 1st of October 1946. And that is a moment for reflection. I was invited a few months ago to the 75th anniversary of the opening of the Nuremberg trial. The 20th of November 1945 was the opening. 20th of November 2020 was the 75th anniversary. I was invited by the President of Germany. There were very few of us there. We were in the middle of COVID, and it was a very remarkable and special event. It took place in Courtroom 600. Can you imagine how it felt for me to be there with the President of Germany, Walter Steinmeier? We were talking. He's a warm and open man. He greeted me very generously. He knew my story. He had read my book, East-West Street. And we both tried to imagine my grandfather imagining his grandson personally invited by the President of Germany to honour a trial which focused on German defendants for mass crimes and mass atrocity. There was something else that we talked about that day, and that was this: the disappearing voices of those who were able to speak firsthand about what happened. That generation will very soon no longer be with us. It's a remarkable and an important generation. And I suppose part of the reason I've done what I've done is to keep the flame alive, to recapture the stories and to pass them on to future generations. But with the disappearance of those voices, it becomes all the more important to record them. I've just finished actually making a radio programme for the BBC. You can hear it on the BBC's internet site. It's called The Nuremberg Legacy. And I tracked down 3 people who were in Courtroom 600 in 1945. A former prosecutor, the remarkable Benjamin Ferencz, aged 101, who remembered with crystal clarity his work in Nuremberg 70 or more years ago. Robbie Dundas, the daughter of the British presiding judge at Nuremberg, who had gone to Nuremberg from Bletchley, where she worked on British intelligence, to interview a couple of the German defendants, Generals Jodl, or Field Marshals Jodl and Keitel. She didn't tell them when she was interviewing them that she was the daughter of the presiding judge. And then she sat in the courtroom and described to me what it was like, and she has never, ever forgotten. And Yves Begbeder, now 95, who was the assistant to the French judge. Again, first-hand accounts of what happened in that courtroom. Voices that remind us about the birth of the idea of international justice, the birth of modern international criminal law. And they continue to inspire me. That trial continues to inspire me. Let me explain how in a very direct way. There are 4 international crimes that have been on our statute books since 1945. War crimes, which were invented in the 19th century, crimes committed during the conduct of war or armed conflict, and then 3 invented in the Nuremberg context. The crime of aggression, waging illegal war, crimes against humanity, killing or harming large numbers of individuals, and the crime of genocide, the destruction of groups. All of these 4 crimes focus very understandably on the protection of individuals, of human beings, of groups of human beings. But there's a gap. What's the gap? The gap is the protection of our natural environment. In 1945, that was not at the forefront of human consciousness. There was no sense that the protection of the environment needed to be addressed through international criminal law. But that has changed. Last November, a year ago, I was approached by a foundation called the Stop Ecocide Foundation. Would I co-chair with a distinguished Senegalese jurist, Dior Fall Sow, a working group, an independent international working group, to come up with a definition of what we have called the 5th crime. And the 5th crime is ecocide, the massive destruction of the human environment. Biodiversity, the climate systems, our oceans, our rivers, our atmosphere, the dumping of hazardous wastes, and so on and so forth. And we spent 6 months, 12 of us, working on coming up with a definition. I'm a rather pragmatic and practical person, and I thought back, as we were doing our work, to Lauterpacht and Lemkin. I thought back to 1944 and 1945, as the war was going on, and these 2 remarkable human beings, instead of curling up and weeping in a corner somewhere about what was going on, decided to take the power of ideas and create their 2 new international crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. And many people laughed at them. Many people said to Raphael Lemkin, your new idea, the crime of genocide, is hopeless. It's never going to come to pass. But he battled on. He got it into the indictment of the Nuremberg trial. And when the judgment failed to mention the word genocide, again, he picked himself up, dusted off his jacket, and spent the next 3 years drafting and lobbying and hustling to get adopted the world's first multilateral human rights treaty, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, signed in Paris in December 1948, shortly before, a day before, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which was an idea of Hersch Lauterpacht's. Again, individuals make a difference. And in drafting our definition of ecocide, I thought about Lemkin. I thought about Lauterpacht. Why did I get involved in this? I got involved in drafting a possible new crime of ecocide to be included into the statute of the International Criminal Court because I've long taught international environmental law and I've long cared about the protection of the environment. It's another part of the work that I do. But more to the point, I have children, and my children are extremely concerned about climate change. They watch, for example, what happens in Australia with rising temperatures and fires and smoke damage and drought and other things that are being replicated across the world in which the connection between human activity and environmental harm becomes clearer and clearer. I'm absolutely convinced that climate change, global heating, let's call it what it is genuinely happening. Like Lauterpacht and Lemkin, I don't believe that the law itself can ever solve a particular problem. It needs to be accompanied by a whole raft of other actions, diplomatic, political, cultural, and it needs, of course, political will. But what the law can do is it can change consciousness. You know, I became very aware of that a couple of years ago when I became involved in litigating the case for Myanmar, for the Gambia, against Myanmar in relation to the mistreatment of the Rohingya. I travelled to Washington, D.C., and I was at a seminar in George Washington University Law School with a man I admire greatly. He's called Thomas Bergenthal. He was the former American judge at the International Court of Justice, and some of you may have read his book, A Lucky Child, Run, Don't Walk. It's an extraordinary book about his account of being a 10-year-old in Auschwitz in the care of one Joseph Mengele. This seminar in Washington that I did with Tom Bergenthal was a month or so, or a few days before the hearings in The Hague. I was acting for the Gambia, as I said, against Myanmar, and Aung San Suu Kyi would turn up to argue the case for Myanmar, and that was a pretty remarkable experience to find her sitting just a few feet from me, like Lauterpacht and Hans Frank, I suppose it might be said, although perhaps the scale of the horror is not quite identical, although pretty terrible. And Tom Bergenthal turned to me during the seminar and he said, "Philippe, how remarkable that you're going to do this case in The Hague next week, based on Lemkin's Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide." And Tom said, "Can you imagine if back in 1943 or 1944 there had been such a convention and a small country had brought a case against Germany on the basis that you cannot treat people, the Jews and the Roma and the Poles and intellectuals and politicals and agitators, as you are treating them, as was happening in the Rohingya case. You cannot treat people like that." And that's the change that's taken place. It's perhaps not perfect, our world, we know that, but there has been progress. There are international standards which say this kind of behaviour is not acceptable. You have to protect the dignity of human beings. You have to protect the rights of individuals and of groups and the members of groups. That is a huge change that has taken place. And so on this occasion, for this oration here in Melbourne, as you reflect on these issues, as people like me go about drafting new possible international crimes, and the Secretary-General of the United Nations has lent his support to the new international crime of ecocide, has called for it to be integrated into the statute of the International Criminal Court, as has the Pope, and have a number of political leaders around the world, not yet in Australia, I'm very, very sorry to say, but a number of leaders have supported it. And that shows a number of things. Ideas matter. Individuals matter. We can make progress. Out of the terrible events of 1933 to 1945, there can be positive developments. As the singer and poet Leonard Cohen put it, there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. Last week I visited the new Second World War and Holocaust Memorial galleries at the Imperial War Museum in London. They've just opened. And remarkably, the Holocaust part of that exhibit ends with life-size portraits of Raphael Lemkin and Hersch Lauterpacht. And that gives me real inspiration and strength. In these difficult times, COVID, climate change, rising populism and nationalism and fascism in different parts of the world, it is possible to imagine a different path. It is possible to imagine the power of ideas and the power of individuals. And that's my main theme in this oration. Each of us can make a difference. Each of us can arrive at a crossroads, and we can put our energies into a tiny but positive thing and make a real difference. That's the theme I want to underscore today. The world is not perfect. I think it's a better world than it was 75 years ago. I think we have principles and standards and rights that did not exist before. They have not ended the horrors, but they have allowed us to say, at least with some degree of objectivity, no, you cannot treat people that way. You cannot treat individuals that way. You cannot treat groups that way. You're aware of that in Australia. You have seen how migrants are being treated in certain parts of Australia. We have seen in London how the other is being treated in many respects. So I think each of us has to be on our guard. We learn the lessons of the past and we apply them to the future. So let me end with this particular message. Nuremberg, for me, is about a fundamental principle. We are all in this together. No person is above the law. Let us protect the values we care about. Let's protect our institutions. Let's fight for the idea of a rule of law, because it is the only language that each of us on this planet has and shares. That was something that Aung San Suu Kyi said to the International Court of Justice a year or so ago. She wasn't right on much in her pleadings, but she was absolutely right on that. It's basically just about all we've got, and let us defend it, defend it, defend it. Thank you so much for inviting me to give this oration. It's a privilege. It's an honour to be with you. I hope to be back with you soon in person. I wish you well in these difficult times, and I hope to see you all very soon. Bye-bye.
My name is Pauline Rockman, and as co-president of the Jewish Holocaust Centre, it's my great pleasure to offer the vote of thanks for this evening of the 13th Oration. This oration was created in 2008 in memory of the late Betty Rosenkranz and to honour the legacy of the late Shmuel Rosenkranz as the second president of the Jewish Holocaust Centre. This evening, Philippe, you have presented some of the challenges going forward relating to justice after the Holocaust and placed them into context. You have given us a superb analysis of the shifting themes in contemporary society with respect to the Holocaust and, sadly, ongoing genocides in the world. Thank you. It is indeed a privilege for the JHC to be the host to you this evening, your morning. Indeed, you're not a stranger to Australia, having visited several times, and we look forward to welcome you in person at our all-new museum in the near future. To Terry, thank you for your wonderful words. I wish to acknowledge the unstinting support of the Goldman and Lazarus family. Thank you for making this event happen and for allowing the legacy of Betty and Shmuel to continue. Shmuel, Zichron Lebracha, would have been very pleased. It's our purpose to enlighten the community and how we look forward to being able to do this in person now that the restrictions have eased. We're so very excited about the new museum building as it moves towards completion and its potential to reach even further. As you are well aware, it takes a great deal of planning to be able to present an evening such as this. I want to thank the dedicated members of the JHC for organising this evening's oration. Special mention to Aviva Weinberg, Robbie Simons and Cian Melser for their great work making this event happen. Thank you. And finally, to all of you who attended, thank you for making this a memorable event. Be safe and take care.